about. So without further ado, Michael, hello.
Hello, hello. Yeah.
So, Michael, you had to sell to health plans with a totally different concept, right? So it's a topic that's very near and dear to your heart because, back in the day, not only were you building a company that didn't exist, right? But you were basically creating an industry that was during that time very kind of looked down upon, right? So,
Yeah.
and you had to figure out how do you position it, how do you differentiate. So talk to us a little bit about that.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. It was really interesting because, we always like to say now we created an industry. We didn't know at the time we were creating an industry, right?
Right.
Because
True.
you're trying to just get a customer to buy something. No, I think that, health plans is for any of you who've done any work in the healthcare space are some of the most complicated uh, customers in the world. And they also have done the same things over and over and over again. For those of you that the United States healthcare system, it's really, while there's been a lot of clinical innovation, anybody who's ever gotten a doctor bill knows that the system's still pretty backward. And so, not only were we selling into a complicated industry, but one that didn't evolve very quickly and certainly didn't evolve in the way that other industries evolved based on consumers pushing them. If you remember the old days of cable TV, cable TV, the customer service used to be terrible until they got competition from others. But health plans didn't really have that. And we still all have terrible experiences with healthcare, even though it's one out of every $6 in our economy. So there are a couple different things that you notice pretty quickly. And many of you I know are selling into larger organizations, is that, going into selling into a large organization and convincing them of something is really difficult. And a lot of times it's very clear to you how what you do benefits them, but very, very difficult to get them to see and grasp and understand and move it. And I'm talking about in the context of, kind of a B2B business, but it's not that different with respect to the consumer. It may not be a complicated sale, but to the consumer, it's a cluttered sale, right? We're putting things in front of them when they get tons and tons and tons of things that they're already getting from many people. And so it's hard to stand out. And so the thing that really struck me, not coming from healthcare view, is that you couldn't just do it the way everybody else was doing it, right? If you just showed up and lined up and said, "Hi, we're going to ask you to do something that you've never done before," that would take years and years and years to convince them of. So you had to really get them to understand very, very quickly, how this was different and how not only just the value it was going to provide to them. And I'm going to talk about other techniques later in this hour about different techniques to use. But also how just could they quickly grasp, right? How could they quickly grasp what it is that we were doing? And so for those of you who know our business, my old business, it was essentially rewarding people for being healthy. And they all had diabetes solutions and things for back pain and pregnancy. And, you name the health condition, they had something, nobody was using it. And so what we thought was, we've got to use analogies that they already know. And this is a technique that in differentiating you can often do, right? So when we thought about analogies that they already knew, we would say things like, look at every other consumer industry. Look at hotels, airlines, credit cards, at the time, many retailers, they all have reward programs. There isn't an industry out there that touches a consumer that doesn't have some type of reward program. And the behaviors you're trying to get those people to do are pretty basic. It's open a bank account, buy something at a retailer, stay at a hotel. Right here, you're asking people to do things that, sure, they should be doing them on their own, but they're not. And they're even more complicated, like go to the gym, don't eat donuts, go for your annual checkups, right? So the first analogy that we got them to understand was, this is just rewarding, just like every other industry does. And so then they go, oh, okay, I can understand that. I can get that. But then you could say, but okay, Michael, that's fine. That makes them get that. But what makes you different? What makes it so that anybody couldn't build a reward platform? And that's when we use this other analogy of essentially a spoke of the hub of a wheel, right? So if you take a wheel, right, and you have different spokes around the wheel, we would say you have diabetes programs and heart disease programs and back pain programs and pregnancy programs, and you have to reward for all of those. You wouldn't get your reward solution from one of those, because if you got one for heart disease and one for diabetes and one for this, you'd end up with 10 of them. You really need to get it from a hub. And so we used to start all of our meetings with this picture of essentially a spoke in a wheel. And we defined everything in the context of that. And so in terms of differentiating, right, now we knew that our model is the only model, but imagine if we went in there and said, we're providing rewards and incentives and technology to do it, it would still be the same solution, but it just wouldn't be differentiated in a way they go, oh, they're the hub of the wheel. So I think a lot of ways in terms of differentiating, we all have to understand people don't pay attention to the details. For those of you who heard us speak before, we talk about this all the time. People do not pay attention to all the pieces of it until they kind of get it. And, we were able to get people to do that in a way that we would just put that diagram up and it's like, that's us in the middle. And if you think that's the right model, right, then we're probably the solution, because nobody else is doing that.
Right, Michael, and I'm sure there's part of this is also kind of breaking the stereotypical beliefs, right? Just because something hasn't been done before, right? It's how do you make somebody understand that even though this is a new concept, right, this is something worth looking into, right? It's kind of the early adapters, right?
Well, I think if that's entrepreneurism, right? We all believe that we're bringing something to the table that's somewhat unique. And in many cases, the more innovative it is, the more differentiated and new it is, right? The last thing that any of us want to do is to sell something that's already out there, right? And yet the easy part about selling something that's already out there is step one. Oh yeah, I get it. I know it's bananas. Bananas cost this. But then you go, that's the easy part, right? Mm-hmm. So you go, oh, cool. Now people understand. But then the second part is the hard part, which is why you're bananas, right? I can get bananas from everybody. So for the same reason that it's different and gives opportunity is the same reason why it's so important when it comes to differentiating that you use things like analogies of things that people already know, like in my example, reward programs, or like, spokes around a wheel where you could draw a diagram and go, that's what we do.
Right.
I hope that makes sense to everybody.
Yeah. And Michael, real quick, I just want to remind everybody, we really want this to be an interactive, session. So please feel free to, chime in and ask questions. We're talking all about, how to differentiate your offering and obviously stand out from competition. And even if your question's a little bit off topic, we'll happily answer them. So please feel free to chime in and, because we want to be able to kind of get into your specific questions.
Great. Thank you, V. So I'm going to try to talk about a couple of different techniques that you can use to really kind of differentiate and stand out. I'm going to expand upon what I just started with, which is analogies that people already know, right? In my example, reward programs, very well known and understood, right? Spokes around a wheel, like you're just basically trying to leverage things that are already in people's heads, because it's really, really hard to teach people new things, because the world is so cluttered, right? So you have to almost think about your business, how to do that. Now, what you can't do is do what many people are doing now, which is we're the Uber of blank, right? So how many times have we heard investment presentations that say we're the Uber of blank? And it's got to be much more specific than that, right? Because people just kind of tune out to that stuff, right? When it's been heard. You have to, this is a lot like, for those of you who have heard us before, we believe that finding a playground where nobody else is playing is probably the most critical things that an entrepreneur does. And in doing that, you really have to work hard to try to find that. It doesn't just jump off the page. If you think about rewarding people for being healthy, it was being done in every other industry except healthcare. All we did was apply it to healthcare. That was our playground, right? But when you go into that playground, you have to define things in a way where, even though what you're doing is new, you have to define it with analogies that people already know, like reward programs in other industries, okay? And this is where the entrepreneurial creativity really comes in. If you really nail that, right, then you are able to really differentiate yourself. I'll give you an example. I don't know, anybody here play Scrabble? It's a little bit of an old school game. I was never really much of a Scrabble player, but my mom was. So any of you who've ever played Scrabble you'd know that there's a tile in there that's a blank, and the blank tile can basically be any letter. So if you need to fill in a word, right, you can use that tile and it can be at any letter. So a lot of times when, like for example, in Lonely Entrepreneur, when we do consulting, one of the types of consulting we like to do is be there for anything, right? Cry on our shoulder, help you with sales, help you with your foundations, right? And a lot of times what I will say is, in some ways, we're like the blank in the Scrabble game. And the 10 minutes I was using to what I thought was pretty clearly describe what we do, there we go, oh, the blank in the Scrabble game, right? So I think that these analogies of things that people already know really help people to get their arms around, oh, okay, I get it. And now I can build on that foundation to understand why they're different. Okay, so the first technique is really, you know, building upon analogies is something that really can help you differentiate and stand out, and people get more clarity in terms of what you're doing and how it is different from somebody else. I'll give you another example. We've worked with a company that is trying to develop technology to do what they call self-showings in real estate, where you don't have to have a broker or an agent. You simply go online and say, okay, great, I want to look at this apartment. You show up, they validate you and they background check you, and you show up and there's a lockbox there, and you're in, right? On your own, completely on your own. And they're, in helping them find their playground, we decided that instead of them being consumer facing, meaning going to the consumer and all the money it takes to get the consumer and to get their own, you know, buildings and landlords that they had, you know, for inventory of apartments, we decided that their playground and nobody else is playing was basically be a technology solution to the existing rental sites out there, like the Zillows and the like. And when we went to customers, we said, okay, how do we make people understand that? We've got this, you know, kind of integrated solution. So we said, you know, we're like the Intel Inside for a listing site, right? Because what we're saying is everybody knows that Intel, you know, not anymore, but certainly historically that was their phrase, right? Like inside your computer, there'd be a little logo on it that would say Intel Inside, because the chip inside was from Intel. And people got it pretty quickly. Oh, so you're the integrated solution for me inside my platform to be able to do it. Now, it doesn't magically mean that they get it 100%, but you can remind people of this, right? And it's one of those things where people kind of get it and understand it. So challenge yourself to think about what analogy to something that people already know will help them understand not only what you do, but how it's differentiated. Okay. D, any questions, or I'll keep going?
I think we're good for now.
Great. I think secondly is a lot of times when we think about differentiation, we don't talk enough about what I've mentioned on several occasions before, which is unique know-how. Okay. I believe, this is my personal belief, there's really only two things that are different in today's world when it comes to differentiation. Number one is brand. And it's very, very difficult to get a brand where people just go, yeah. I mean, there are for every Chanel there are thousands of brands, many of which have gone out of business that were these iconic brands that over time, as technology has come, right, just can't even survive. Even, you know, big retail names and the like. It's really, really hard to get a brand where people just know the brand, trust the brand, and buy from the brand. The secondly is know-how, because I would argue that anybody can copy technology, right? To come up with groundbreaking technology is really, really, really hard, right? And people come to the table and say, our technology is unique and this, in a lot of ways, it's the way you apply the technology, right? So it's really, really hard for technology to be a differentiator. But the know-how that goes into what's built into that technology, right? Or the know-how that's used in your business overall, the know-how you bring to the table about an area, right? That if someone doesn't have, whether it's a service you provide or technology you provide, right, really makes the difference. So I'll give you an example. I've mentioned before a couple of times this great little company called Whisker Docs that we've worked with. Whisker Docs is kind of a subscription service that if you want to do anything for your pets, you get a subscription and you can kind of solve all your pet issues that you wouldn't go to the vet for, which is basically every day, right? And you can go online and do it, and you can use some self-service algorithms to do it. You can opt up to talk to a vet tech or even a vet if you want. So think of it that way. And when they were originally going to a lot of their potential customers, they sold to consumers, but they also sold to businesses like pet insurance companies and other. When they would go, they would say, well, okay, it's you're giving me like a call center and some online tools, and why am I going to pay big technology or license fees for the solution? And what we started to help them do is to really say, yes, the technology matters, there's no question, but it's the fact that your know-how is built into the technology. For example, if somebody calls up and they see that their dog is having this reaction, right? And it doesn't seem like a big deal, but you found out what they ate a minute before, and I'm not just talking about like chocolate, right, that everybody knows, would seem like something minor. And then you'd have something where it would seem like something major, where it was actually something minor, and give those examples of what's built into the algorithms of your technology, right? So for example, in New York City, where I'm back at, you can probably hear the sirens in the background, which you may not have heard before or for a while. In New York City, there aren't many trees throughout the streets, the concrete jungle, as they call it. But outside of apartment buildings, there'll be one tree, surrounded by a tiny little gate, but there'll be foliage in the tree. And as you can imagine, if a dog goes out for a walk, the first thing the dog wants to do is jump in there and eat stuff. Well, it turns out that a lot of the buildings put pesticides on that foliage because they don't want people to eat it. But so imagine somebody calls up Whisker Docs and says, hey, my dog is this, that, and the other thing. And they didn't ask where they were from, and they didn't ask what they were doing. So it's all of this experiential know-how, right, that really makes you stand out. I mean, I've shared before, my own thoughts that everybody can get everything for free and there's tons of competition everywhere. So why do you win, right? You win because you bring this unique know-how. Now that unique know-how might be delivered in the form of a service. It might be delivered in the form of what's built into your technology. So you might not say my technology is unique, but the know-how we have about X is built into that. And here are some very specific examples of that. Okay, so that know-how has to not be something that comes in the third or fourth act. If you believe the premise that I'm sharing with you, that only a couple of things stand out, like know-how, that has to be front and center, right? Those tidbits of information that demonstrate that whatever product or service you're going to come to the table with, right? It's the know-how around it that really is what makes you what is the subject of this talk today, which is different. Okay, and you have to make that front and center in your web properties, front and center in your marketing materials, right? And if you don't do that, it becomes very, very difficult to differentiate because everybody says they have great customers. Everybody says they have a great website. Everybody says that they're the most cost effective and blah, blah, blah. You have to bring a know-how to the table that demonstrates to them, oh man, this is the company that I want to use for what I'm trying to solve. Okay. So what I would, just like I challenged you before, to think a little bit about analogies that people know, right? I think it's incredibly important to cull out examples of know-how, and they can't be general. They cannot be general things because that's the know-how that everybody has in your industry. Okay? They have to be esoteric things that you would only know if you were doing it over and over and over again. Okay? And bringing those out is incredibly important. And it's what ultimately makes customers go, oh, wow, that's a different type of vendor that really understands a lot more about this. Give you an example from a couple of examples, because these aren't just natural. Back in my old healthcare business, we had incentives for weight, that were run by big health plans. And, if you lose this amount of weight, and for some reason they started to use your waist to measure your waist for weight. I don't know why, as opposed to just pounds. And a woman walked into a doctor's office and was getting this this validated by her weight, or by her doctor rather, and she couldn't earn the incentive because she was pregnant. And she called up the CEO of Aetna, who was sponsoring the program, and said, I can't believe this is not fair, right? So imagine somebody like Aetna, right? I remember we were the vendor, so we didn't know anything about this at the time. But as soon as that happened, we would then go into our next sales meetings. And when somebody would say, well, wait a minute, it's just a reward program. There's a million reward companies out there. We would say, no, healthcare is unique. And we would tell that story. And the person on the other end of the table would be like, oh man, I wouldn't have even guessed. And oh, by the way, they called the CEO of Aetna, which is what I'm going to talk about next, which is risk. Okay. So when you spend time in an arena and you believe you've identified something that is unique and different with the service or product that you've offered, right? You're bringing this to the table in such a way that it's front and center. And remember, this also applies to a consumer-based business, right? Don't get me wrong. If you're just putting up a portal and you're selling your product and service and you're selling it and you're saying, okay, my price is cheaper and this and that, but as we all know, that's harder and harder to do, right? You have to, that's why you see so many people when they talk about how people use your solutions or how people use cooking materials, how people use how people wear clothing. That's why you're getting these online style companies that are doing things on the fly, because what they're trying to do is bring a level of know-how and capability that goes, oh, they're really guiding me because they know a lot more about this than me. Okay, we all have this know-how, right? What we have to be able to do is we have to be able to bring it front and center, make it be an aha moment for somebody. So ultimately, when somebody sees that, they perceive you a different way. And what that results in is not only differentiation, but it results in not having challenges when it comes to your price, right? Because they're no longer comparing apples to apples, right? Now they're comparing the apples to oranges. And if they're really looking for value, then the value comes in perhaps paying a higher price for something that is really going to be insightful for them, either as a consumer or as a business. Think about, I always ask myself and others to say, think about when you are buying something. What is it that makes you to pay attention to anything, right? In many cases, right, it's like, oh, I didn't know that, or I needed to know that, right? But a lot of times it's buried, kind of down in marketing materials or down, as opposed to, right, we really understand this in a way that that others don't. I mean, listen, for those of you that know the story of the lonely entrepreneur, we've been through it. We watched our business almost get destroyed in 2008 and built it back up, and we think we know something about it because we've been there. Think about when other entrepreneurs go to you and say, or other people that maybe have not been entrepreneurs, and give you advice. You kind of go, I appreciate your advice, but I don't think you really know what it's like, right? So that positioning of your know-how in a very specific way is critical. And I want to make sure that people understand, because it's hard. This is something that's hard to grasp. When we build products and services as entrepreneurs, we intimately believe that they're different. Otherwise, we wouldn't be doing it. There's some problem in the world that's not being solved. There's some solution that's not being delivered. And we believe whatever it is needed and different. The world, on the other hand, doesn't. Right? And sometimes we have the perception, right, that we can just show up, serve up our different thing, and people should go, yeah, I understand. Think about rewarding people for being healthy. It's a no-brainer, right? I give you a reward, you do a behavior, and oh, by the way, if you don't do the behavior, I don't pay you the reward. right? So what we have to be able to do is to understand that these types of things that really stand out, right, in all the ways that you're talking to the marketplace, right? It would be better to say when you're selling, a dress, there's one thing you should not wear with this dress. Click here. Than it would be to say we have this great black dress, because everybody says we have this great black dress. Okay? Remember, we all use the same tools, and now we're all using them at scale. When people are using digital marketing, right, everybody's using the same thing, and people are not paying attention a lot, including us, to the differences between all those things. So this know-how really has to stand out.
Michael, so to your point, David asked a good question. Any thoughts on how to effectively convey the intimate know-how in digital marketing?
Yeah, I think it really has to jump off the page, right? The challenge these days is, people's attention span are really, really thin. So if you look at recommendations on like what should be on a landing page or a website, people are really trying to skinny it down, and that's fine. But you have to try to integrate these tidbits of know-how, right, into your marketing. So, for example, one of our team members at Lonely Entrepreneur got me a mug, and the mug said, it had a nice Lonely Entrepreneur logo on it, and said, if someone asks you if you're working on Columbus Day, they're not an entrepreneur. Right? So David, if you put that, if you're trying to say, we understand entrepreneurs, how many websites to say, we understand you as an entrepreneur and we want to help you? Every bank says this, every software company like says, we get you, right? But when somebody says that, they're like, yep, they get it. Right? So that know-how, again, that's not the greatest level of know-how, but that know-how has to jump out, right, in a way that, the challenge is, how do you do that in as few words as possible? How do you do it in a visually pleasing way? But what I would suggest is, whether it's digital marketing or anything else, if 90% of the other companies that do what you do are going to say the same things, like some of the things I rattled off before, you're not going to win, right? So you have to try to bring this stuff front and center in all of the ways that you're serving up your product or service.
Just reminds me of the kind of entrepreneurial creativity, right, that we always talk about. And it's kind of asking yourself the 7 whys, right? Like why somebody would pay attention, right? And you go a level deeper, like why this, right? Why this language? Why this and that? And until you get to the point where you're like, okay, that's hard to argue, or that's hard to change, right? It's constantly kind of reiterating, and this is not meant to be easy.
Well, I think also, and it's a good point, V, but I also think that sometimes we don't accept enough that everybody is using the same tools, right? Like if everybody is building a website, right, and you took 10 websites that did, I don't know, accounting, how much are they going to say stuff different? They may know they're different for whatever reasons they're different, right? But most people are going to say exactly the same things, right? If someone did an ad that said, you're going to look ugly in this dress, that's a better ad than being one of 1,000 that says we're all going to look great in this dress, right? So if you know that everybody, is websites, social media, digital marketing across all these different platforms are all used by everybody, then why is it that somebody stands out? I mean, think of ourselves as consumers. What do we pay attention to? Do you pay attention to ads that say this blank is great? Right? There's got to be some other value brought to the table, right, that ultimately differentiates you from others.
Mm-hmm. All right, and I have another really good question. Sorry, folks, any questions on what Michael was just saying? I want to make sure. Okay. Any tips on how to simplify a complex business or concept?
Great question.
Sorry,
one of
and
the things,
Lawanda, I'm with you. Honesty always catches my eye and interest. Yep. Good
yeah,
point.
Lawanda, that's a great point. But by the same token, does any vendor out there say they're being dishonest? Right? They all,
All right.
and now don't get me wrong, you may be saying honesty, being genuine, right? All of those different types of things, 100%, right? But nobody comes to the table and says, I remember in healthcare, my team was like, well, we really have to say how much our program is engaging people. And I was like, go to every website out there in our industry. How many of them say we don't engage people? None. How many entrepreneurs that are giving a presentation in front of investors don't say something other than we're awesome, right? So these types of things really have to jump out, right? And whatever it is that that brings the know-how to life. I see a comment here about stories. It's one of the next things we'll talk about, which is stories tell a story, right? Just like analogies tell a story. I'm gonna talk about this in a minute, right? So and in fact, we do it all the time at Lonely Entrepreneur about why we developed our company to do this stuff. So I think that the ability to have this know-how come to life, right, with an understanding of all the clutter that's out there, right? We really have to have that, and not just, well, when somebody pays attention to our solution, they will figure it out. They're not going to pay attention unless you give them a reason to. Okay, and that's just so critical to cutting through.
Yep. Sorry, and the question I was asking, any tips on how to simplify a complex business or concept when merging two different industries?
Here's one of the things that I would say. In fact, I'm reading this awesome book right now called, I don't know if you guys can see it, Simple. Right? Here's what I would say. One of the things about running a small company, an entrepreneurial venture, is that a lot of times we, the founder, get it. And we will say things like, other people don't get it. That's a failure on our part. It's not a failure on the market's part, because we can go to bed every night and go, everybody else doesn't get it, but that just leads to a failed company. Our job is to get everyone to get it. Who's everyone? It's our customers, it's our investors, it's our employees, it's our vendors. In order for people to get it in a cluttered world, it must be simple, right? It will not come through if it's not simple. So you say to yourself, okay, how do you simplify it, right? You can't think of features, functionalities, right? You can't think of like the detailed stuff that makes it happen, right? You've got to think of the big rock simplicity, right? Like think about the example I gave you before about the spoke in the wheel, right? Spoke in the wheel doesn't really have anything to do with incentives. It's just trying to simplify something into a concept that people already have. So obviously I'd have to know more specifically about the industries that you're emerging. We'd be happy to talk to you about it. But I think that you can't allow yourself to have a long descriptive thing, because frankly, no one's going to pay attention to it and no one's really going to understand, right? I'll give you an example. Lonely Entrepreneur was founded on a whim. I wasn't looking to do it after I sold my healthcare company. And it was just so obvious to me that there's all this stuff for entrepreneurs all over the planet, and it's not in one place. And that we did a real disservice. So let's create a one-stop shop for hopefully the answers that entrepreneurs need. You hope that's a simple concept. And then you validate and say, are they doing that for me? Are they doing it well? You know, all that kind of stuff. So I think that the goal of simplifying is not the goal, but the techniques for simplifying is really boiling it down to things that people already know, and just aligning your stuff to something that they already believe in their head. Occasionally, Uber, right? You know, now we go Uber, of course, but imagine the first time somebody came with Uber. They're like, what do you mean? I'm going to get in somebody else's car? I'm going to stay in someone else's home, you know, Airbnb, right? Foreign. right? So those are big groundbreaking things that take millions and millions and millions of dollars. And that's why those companies have still not made money, because it takes a lot to do that. You have to really try to build on things people already know. But it's not, it's a lot like finding your playground where nobody else is playing. This is the special sauce, right? This is, you got to put it in a blender and it's a soupy mix. And what comes out of it is, right, these unique positionings with analogies that we know, right? Using the know-how we have, and always trying to make sure that you're simplifying. Cool.
Awesome.
I want to go on to stories because I'm really glad that somebody mentioned, because that's the next technique that I was going to kind of go into. Stories are incredibly powerful at people going, yes, I understand that. And also at, yes, I understand that. And oh, by the way, you're different, right? And the way that you tell those stories and create those analogies. So for example, in the rewards industry, back in the day, not anymore, but back in the day, when you interacted, for example, with a bank, you got, a toaster for opening up a bank account, and you got reward points for using their credit card. Like, it was this hodgepodge of stuff. And we're like, that's the way it is, right? But if you tell that story of an experience, somebody integrating with a bank, you don't have one universal reward program. And that's what you're going to end up with if you don't have one universal reward program, right? So you would tell the story of an individual who would interact with a bank, right? And that those stories are, stories or analogies, right? I guess it's closer to that as well. Really help kind of congeal, right, how to do it, right? So you guys have heard me tell the story of how the name The Lonely Entrepreneur got started. I was helping people in New York for fun after I sold my business, and one of them said being an entrepreneur is really lonely. And I was like, that's interesting. And then a couple of weeks later, I was walking down the street with a friend of mine, and I told him that. I said, lonely entrepreneur. And he's like, wow, that's it. I'm like, what? And he goes, that's what we all share, is the struggle. That name's everything. I was like, And he literally dragged me in a Starbucks, and he goes, watch this. And I'm like, what are you doing? And he screams, who here is a lonely entrepreneur? And like 70% of the people raise their hand, right? And that's a story that people go, oh, yeah, that might've been me in a Starbucks, right? So telling stories, and remember, the stories can't just be about your personal journey, because frankly, no offense, nobody cares about all of our personal journeys until you give them a reason to care. It may be a heartfelt story, and that may engender you to want to spend time and pay attention. 100%, that happens all the time, right? In fact, many companies that don't have a real purpose behind them are, people don't want to pay attention. But the best stories are the ones that communicate your product and service in a way, right, that really cut through. I'll tell you one. I may have told this one before, so if you've heard of it, I apologize. A politician in Miami, Florida, not too far from the tragic events we're hearing about over the last day or two, there's a running for office for Miami Beach mayor. And there was a very, very well-funded state senator woman who was running, and a local politician. Well, the local politician had a scandal with about a week left and had to drop out of the race. So there's a week left in a very close race against a very, very well-funded and polished politician. And so they go to a local assistant district attorney, and they say, listen, we need somebody to run. You're going to get slaughtered, but it'll be good for your visibility. Do you want to do it? And so the assistant DA said, sure. So they have a debate with a week left, and the polls are, 50% for the woman and virtually nothing for this unknown new person who now has to run last minute. And they said to the assistant district attorney, so what's your agenda? And he said, listen, I grew up in Miami Beach. I think I know it pretty well. I'm going to fix the potholes, on 5th and Collins, right? So they go over to the woman and they said, so Senator, what is your response to that? And she gave a very polished political answer and said, not only am I going to fix the potholes on 5th and Collins, but I'm going to fix every pothole in the city, and no one's ever going to have a flat tire from a pothole again, or whatever she said. And then they went back to the assistant district attorney and said, what is your response to that? And he said, there is no pothole on 5th and Collins. And the room went silent. And the next day the polls were 50-50 and he ended up winning, right? So with a simple story, right? Like I tell you that story and you're like, oh, that's know-how, right? You're different. She had more money. Think about what we face as an entrepreneur. Everyone has more money, more ideas. If it's a big enough idea, Google and Apple will care about it, right? But what he had was know-how. And you can see that just me telling you that story, when I first heard that story, I was like, wow, that's know-how overcomes time, money, stature, and undermined trust in like that. Okay. So there's stories you can tell about not just how your company got started, but experiences that you've had, right? Told in a genuine way that can help a customer understand not only what your product or services is, but why it's different. And those stories can often be very powerful. We're working with somebody that's creating this great service, so needed, which basically brings together everything you need around death, right? Death is bad enough, but right now there's so many things that you have to deal with there's nowhere one place to go, right? And she tells her very personal story about the fact that not only she was dealing with a tragedy in her family, but she had to deal with this and this and this and this and this. And why wouldn't there be one place to go where everything was there for you so you could manage this incredibly difficult time period in your life, right? And her story of what she went through, people really identify with, because anybody that's been unfortunate to go through a death circumstance knows just how difficult it is, not only to deal with what happened, but also all the things that go around it. Okay, so remember these techniques, and I'm going to give you a fourth one. A fourth one, and I don't know if it's so much literally about differentiating, but it's certainly something that cuts through the noise, and that is risk, right? If you are, sometimes you go in and you say, hey, we have this great product or service. This is why you should buy it, right? And somebody goes, that's terrific. Yes, that's what we're all trying to do. But in many cases, buying gets accelerated because of risk. Okay. That risk can come to life in lots of different ways. That risk can be, you don't look right at the dinner party. That risk could be, it can be a million different things that risk is. The analogy that I use for my healthcare business all the time is that we were doing a bunch of reward programs for a big bank for their regions. And we called up, so we already approved vendor, we were already using our technology. We called up National and we said, hey, National, we're doing this for one region. You should do this across the country. And they're like, we don't care. We let every region do their own thing. And we're like, but wait a minute, you guys are spending all this money on healthcare and whatever. And they just didn't have any interest in it. And a couple of weeks later, we read an article that it was in a payroll magazine. Somebody read an article that the big consulting firms, for any of you who had friends that have worked for consulting firms, they'd disappear for a month. They'd go on the road to do these consulting gigs and they'd come home, and oftentimes they'd be away from their families for a while. And so their managers would give them, kind of little bonuses and rewards. They say, here's $1,000 gift card, take your wife, your husband out for a nice dinner, whatever. And it turns out that one of the big consulting firms that shall remain nameless wasn't keeping track of these, and they were never taxing it as income to the employee. So the IRS came down on as a big thing. So rewards that were being given out in these banks were like, some manager gives it to a teller for $50, right? And no one's keeping track of that. So we basically called up the same people at this large bank and said, essentially, you guys are all going to jail. And they're like, what I'm talking about? They're like, read this article, right? There's people all over the country that are giving away incentives. You're just not tracking them. And that's why this one group in Northern New Jersey did this, and the next day they're like, we need to get on the phone. So now don't get me wrong. They may say, okay, now I have to fix this, and why are you different and all that stuff. So that's not purely a differentiation thing, but it is something that makes your offering stand out, is by them feeling as if they don't have it. That, because they could say, great, Michael, thanks for the idea, we're going to go figure it out. But if that risk is great enough, again, it goes with that know-how, right? If that risk is great enough and you know the industry, then hopefully the value proposition to them is, oh, these are the guys that I should really be talking to. Okay, so I want to leave it for a couple of minutes for questions at the end, but analogies, right, is super important, right, for things that people already understand. Know-how, right? Make sure your know-how is coming to the table. Stories, right? Make sure that you're bringing to the table stories or use stories to clarify. And finally is risk, right? Don't just sell kind of in a generic way. Sell in a way that creates kind of some risk or liability to the person, whether it's the consumer or the business that you're selling to.
Awesome insights. As Michael said, if anybody wants to jump in and just, ask a couple of questions or comment on anything, please do.
I have a question, Michael. And I jumped in late, so I didn't get all the goodness that you were dishing out, but what I got was really good. And I was the one that asked the question about the merging of two industries and simplifying. Mm-hmm. So my business is called Diverse Dining, and we basically pair food with what is traditionally known as like diversity inclusion trainings to
that's great.
Break cultural barriers and help build better relationships across culture.
Yep.
And for me, so the fortunate thing for my business is we have in some way done a good job with getting media's attention as far as like, the news and the radio stations and stuff like that.
Yep.
I feel like I struggle a lot of times with my own, and there's been some improvement within the last few months, obviously because of COVID. But with my sales pitch and just helping people who I know, especially during this time, need the solutions that we provide to understand how we're providing it. Yep. So I was the one who kind of asked that question. I have some ideas going around, but I don't know if just giving you a little bit of context about my business helps. I feel like because it's all in my head and what we do. So really quickly, I'll say this, a couple of things that we have done outside of like the training. So we have done a lot of business to business and then consumer business to consumer. So we host a like monthly event that's open to the public, as well as companies can hire our organization, and we do trainings for corporations, which is where our main profit is as a company. In addition to that, we formed a lot of partnerships with organizations that have, for instance, I don't know if you're familiar with like City Tens, but they're like a organization. We partner with them and help to get more diverse businesses, more diverse restaurants, recognition around the city. Mm-hmm. So all of my work leads back to the initial thing that I said, but I do feel like sometimes I feel like I'm all over the place, and I feel like trying to explain what I do is all over the place. Yep. So I'll let you talk for a second, and then I can, I guess, answer any clarifying questions.
Yeah. So what you just described, hey, it's all in my head. Who on this call doesn't go, yeah, that's me too, right? So it's everybody feels that first and foremost. Here's what I say. I think you have a huge opportunity. Don't worry about merging two industries. Here's what I would say. If you are implementing diversity initiatives and you are not including in that the food that people are eating, not only could your initiatives fail, but you could actually have them backfire. Mm-hmm. So think of it this way. I go to corporate America. I've got my diversity council, right? My internal diversity council, which has all these representatives. We spent all this time and money on this, and we're trying to really do it. And they serve food that's offensive, right? Mm-hmm. Think about the statements where somebody will talk about, I remember this happened in the NBA one time, and somebody referenced very cliche, like fried chicken, right? And there was like so I would say to you, think about that last thing about risk, right? If your diversity program does not include the food you're serving, then you could essentially undermine absolutely everything that you're doing. And I think there's a huge opportunity to talk to that, because it's frankly, we're involved a lot in the diversity space, and that's something I haven't heard before about the food. You know, it's there somewhere, but no one's positioned it that way. That's your playground.
Okay.
You should basically say that any diversity program that is not considering the food that's being served is not only going to not be complete, it actually could backfire, because all of those employees involved or all those customers involved could be like, they really serve that food when they're telling us they're trying to do diversity.
So can I add something really quick, Michael?
Sure.
This is Fair with Lonely Entrepreneur, Director of Marketing. I worked for a chocolatier, a French chocolatier in my early 20s. We had a concept of touring the world through chocolate. And so she was trying to open people's minds through the commonality of chocolate. So she'll have like curry and, red stripe beer from Jamaica, but she didn't do it well because she didn't do her research, like what you're saying. And some of the lines actually got her sued.
Oh, wow.
So like I've seen other industries do it and fail. And so there's nothing more personal and than food. And I think I just wanted to say, if you want to look at how she's done it, it's Vosges, Vosges, au chocolat. And it's done in a very like luxurious type way, like where a small box of chocolate is just $25 or something. But so if you can just take a look at that as a reference, and for someone who's done it in a chocolate space, but not as blown out and purposeful, if you will, as yours.
Yeah.
This is where, and I know we're running up against time, but this is where a lot of the techniques that we're talking about here can come to life, right? So you have a know-how, you have an understanding, but there's also this risk factor, right? Of right now, out of 100 diversity programs, I guess 10 are thinking about food, right? And you have to say, well, if you're not thinking about food, you're actually not addressing the problem, because this is such a critical part of it. And if you're serving the wrong food, you really aren't being culturally sensitive. You're just, so anyway.
Thank you. Or if you're just serving food, because there's a lot of companies that just do a lot of food sharing around that. That is their whole diversity program. is okay, let's bring in dishes. So yeah, I like that.
But if you are serving the Black community, the Latinx community, the whatever the community is, and food is not a core element of your diversity program, you could undermine the whole program, because you go into a meeting and people are like, oh, we put 50 employees from our Black resource group in a meeting together, and they serve them food that just doesn't reflect what we're trying to do.
Great. Thank you so much, everybody. I know we're up against the time. Please tune back in next Friday, 12 Eastern. We will be here, and thank you for all the questions and comments. And again, have a great weekend. We'll see you back here next Friday.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.